All right.
Okay. All right, folks, if you could take a nice deep breath
Can I be
and
heard?
make sure that you mute yourselves. Who is that?
Somebody had a question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I just want to make sure I can be heard. My name is James Brown. I'm calling. I'm on from Ghana, Africa.
Oh,
And
All
I
right.
can see you guys clear. I just want to know if I could be heard.
You can be heard, but we're not seeing you, James. Can you turn on your video camera?
1 second.
There you are.
You can see me now?
I can see you now.
Well,
Hey,
who at the stand?
Hello. Hello.
hi.
And this is my wife, Monica.
Hello.
Nice to meet you. We're about to start the class, James, so if you would mute yourself, and I'm going to ask everyone to mute themselves so that we can get this opening ritual done, and then we'll get on it.
all right.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All right, so take a nice deep breath. Remember that the opening ritual is a prayer for us, so please have that in mind. Eternal brothers and sisters, we are now about to open a Church of Light meeting in the customary manner. And in so doing, let us consider seriously the purpose for which we have gathered together, the purpose which, since the dawn of human intelligence, has drawn true brothers and sisters of the light into holy convocation, the purpose which during all ages has attracted the spiritual efflorescence of every epoch together at selected meeting places, the purpose which has ever impelled the noblest and most exalted souls of earth to band together for our common effort. That purpose is to study nature's laws, to unfold the divine attributes of the soul, to secure conscious immortality, and to attain royal grandeur that surrounds the true perfected human. And here is our prayer. O thou eternal spirit, in whom we live, move, breathe, and have our being, consecrate this meeting to the cause of truth and righteousness. As brothers and sisters of the light, we seek knowledge at the shrine of goodness. Therefore, by virtue of our unselfishness and sincerity in desiring to assist in thy works, we ask the help of legions of light and their protection from all forces of darkness. So shall it be. Thank you,
Shall it be?
everyone.
All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this book 10-2. This is the continuation of how to set up a chart, how to interpret a chart with a focus on progression. So we'll be looking a little bit back at 10-1 as well, and then obviously 10-2. An enormous amount of this material is really focused on putting in the individual work, but we'll get into that more. You can see the agenda up on the screen. After that, we will have a closing ceremony. We'll stop the recording, and then we'll do a period of question and answer. If you have questions, you can always put them in the chat box so that we can all see. And we'll try to address those either as we go or certainly during the question and answer period. So let's begin and get into our time frame. Oops, what happened there? That's not the way that's supposed to work. All right. A little technical difficulty there. Not sure why that did that. All right, so let's go here. Progressing the horoscope is the emphasis of this book 10-2. But quite frankly, it's really about taking step by step the process that Zane has outlined and repetition. Doing as many different charts, as many opportunities you can on different individuals, not just yourself, but to be able to look at a variety of situations and scenarios. The reason is that the more you do, you begin to have a base of reference of working from that 3-ring notebook that I hope you have set up to look at the impact of the signs, the astral bodies, as well as aspects that may be represented. Again, all that information has been spread through the previous 9 books, and it's important to be able to capture it and interpret it in your own words and have it as a reference so that you can easily get back to it. Information that you can't find is really not very valuable. The more that you do it, the more you begin to integrate this in, and also will encourage you to take the other classes that are offered within the Church of Light to be able to work with the horoscope. The other thing that I think is really, really useful is to go to light.tv, which is one of the links off the Church of Light in the member section, and to review some of those sessions that are there. I don't remember the exact number, but there's at least, I believe, 10, if not more, recordings of interpretation of charts, questions and answers. It is a wealth of information that is there for your use. The more that you take in, the better you are. Now, having said that, I also want to emphasize that I think it's really important, and the way that the Church of Light is oriented is use these materials. Please do not use outside materials at this part of your learning. It just adds confusion. Learning one system well, I believe, is paramount, and you will find that it is critical for you to then later have a foundation to be able to evaluate other methodologies and other things that you later may want to bring in. Or you may find, like many of us have, that this is really a complete set of work in itself, and it's really unnecessary to use other materials to be able to interpret. I do encourage you to do, from the new moon to the full moon, to do at least 5 charts. If you've not already done so, of those, 1 or 2, I think it's important to cast those by hand. Now, I know if you've had difficulty doing that, join the crowd. It is extremely tedious and makes you appreciate how much our not so ancient brethren and sister had in terms of being able to manually construct these charts without the use of a computer. What we're going to do at some point in the future is that we are going to have 1 or 2 classes on how to manually prepare a chart so that you can make sure and have all the nuances. The directions are fairly straightforward, but it's easy to get confused and lost. It is critical that it be exact and be accurate, especially if you get off in terms of not setting the ascendant, not setting the midheaven, not setting the various components of the charts correctly. You will be off for the rest of your calculations and interpretations. So really encourage you to do that and to understand and try it before and make every effort to understand what you do and you don't know, or what list of questions that you have. I also encourage you to, if you can financially afford it, to obtain the Church of Light computer program. It is a wealth of information, as well as already designed to interpret and to cast the charts the way that we do them. What you will not find in other programs in particular is the use of astrodynes, or cosmodynes is another word for them, where we talk not just about the relationship of the sign, the planets, or the houses, but we talk about prioritization of both positive and negative influences and how to prioritize which ones for sure that we ought to look at and which ones have lesser impact. Use the rules and steps outlined in book 10-1, chapter 8, serial lesson 110, pages 154 through 158. If you have not copied those into your notebook or separately put those on paper, I really believe it is critical, because each item is important. I also found, and I believe you will too, that being methodical in how you pull together a chart and how you understand it, doing it consistently and with the same methodology time and again, you will find that it will start to go faster. You will start to have those indications and in leanings that help you to interpret better. The other thing that I believe is really important, and it's kind of referred to in the materials, but not emphatically stated, is keep track of what was accurate and what maybe was off. We learn as much from our mistakes as we do our successes. But that is why I use and I recommend getting one of the calendars that was talked about, particularly if you're looking at events within your own life, but also for others, that you can kind of keep track of that information, at least in a way that can be found. Or you can set up another tab within your 3-ring notebook of successes and hits and misses in terms of those charts that you take a look at. If you find that you are making the same or having the same type of misses over and again, it's probably worthwhile to speak with someone, gather as much information as can, and so that way we can all look at it and say, oh, I see what you're doing. Often that revelation will come to yourself, and talking to a third party is not necessary. But again, we're here to answer questions, and we want it to be useful to you because this is how we understand the forces at play. As you may have heard, the Earth's weakening magnetic field means that we are seeing, I believe, greater impact by these unseen electromagnetic forces that's happening in the world around us. And this is a cyclic thing that occurs periodically through history. And we're in another one of those cycles where this type of influence we can see, and we can then look and say, wow, that starts to make sense. And we can take the appropriate actions in terms of spiritual and mental alchemy to be able to, if not minimize, or at least push back a little bit on those influences. Remember, the future is not certain. There are multiple paths because there are interventions that can be taken overtly or inadvertently that can change the course. So when we look at, especially your own, or you see something that may be a huge detrimental effect, that does not mean that there is certainty of it occurring. All that means that if otherwise uninfluenced or unaffected, that these events can have their sway. So again, if you haven't gotten that Church of Light astrology program, I really encourage you to do it. It's very reasonably priced. We're not looking, and this does not make a profit per se, but it is one of those things that will help you, again, not make mathematical errors, not make charting errors. Then you can really spend your time on interpreting and understanding the various events. I also want to encourage you to take a look at, it's on page 7, which I think is really interesting, of the first chapter. And that is, it talks about that not all astral and planetary bodies are impacted in the way that we approach astrology. We don't do the moons of various planets. We haven't, and we don't really look at fixed stars. And the reasoning for that is well explained within the first chapter. Again, some astrological programs get into that in depth, and also things that are like the nodes of the moon and others that I think just gets too cumbersome. So let's just stick with what we have, and I think you'll find that you can become very accurate and very predictive, and start seeing the reasoning and the influence of what's happening in your life and as you look for other people. One of the things that I also do, and this isn't something that's necessarily recommended in the book per se, But when I do a chart for someone else, I ask them, is there one central question that you're concerned about? What that does is it helps to focus then on a specific house, on a specific planetary influence, or just helps you to, if you will, focus the discussion that you're going to have with them. And it's just an opportunity to bring it back to a practical application. Otherwise, you could spend hours talking to a person about all the potential, and you may or may not address the question they have. So ask them what specific question or questions they have so that you can pull a focus around that and look at the aspects and the planetary relationships based upon that. You're going to find that even after you complete your Hermetic certificate, you complete all the volumes, that you are nowhere near an expert. We're all students. And this is just launching you with the foundation to be able to add a lifetime of experience, practice, and most importantly to me, record keeping, so that you can make sure that any biases, omissions, influences that keep reoccurring, that you can address those and not fall into any traps. All right. Oh, hit or miss astrology. Yes, I'm looking at the questions here. That's where you find that anything that you said this was an influence, either it occurred being a hit or it did not occur, and that could be seen as a miss. But again, this is all dependent on, we're not doing soothsaying. We're not doing divination at this point. What we're looking at are those influences. That's why one of the interesting things is if you go back and look at charts based upon significant events in a person's life, that is also another way to understand and see how they're the things that have occurred, the experiences that help shape who they are and how they have grown as an individual. I like to do that. It takes time, and the individual may or may not wish to do that. But again, for those who are interested, particularly in formative events, death in the family, significant illness or others, it can be very enlightening. So excellent question. Now, in terms of the Hermetic system of progression, Zane spends quite a bit of time talking about velocity and time. We know about velocity in terms of definitions such as the speed of light. We often do not think of time as something that is a factor that can be influenced. But what we begin to see, especially as we deal with the inner and outer plane, that both speed, velocity, time, in terms of how it's seen, are variables. They are not static, but very dynamic. As we look in the, especially in the other planes, we may see that the speed of light is not a speed limit or a restriction. Hence, when you're dealing with understanding events, as I say, it may or may not be, if you're looking at the inner plane versus the outer plane, an understanding of what the applicable limits may be. And time is something that even in Einstein's theory of relativity, which was being discussed and being understood at the time Zane was writing this in the 1930s, is something that can be warped, it can be shaped, and possibly can be changed and altered. So this is just an interesting discussion that helps set the perspective, and you will see and hear more about this in the future. Progressed aspects, and this is a fundamental application. Progressed aspects build tentative aerials. Now what we mean by this is that remember that we are and we interact with electromagnetic influences all around us. That means that when there's planetary formations, when we move into certain astrological configurations, that a progressed aspect can indicate then a sensitivity or receptivity to certain types of situations based upon the house, based upon the sign, based upon the planetary influences. Now, again, we look at intensity, the harmony or disharmony of astrodynes as an influence, and how this has influenced thought cells. But also remember that we are looking to the impact in terms of how it looks at our natal chart and how the progressed, both the major progressed, minor progressed, and transits align with the natal and also the major progressed. Many people, like you read the astrology, the horoscope in the paper, is focused on transits. Some individuals get very focused in on the minor progressed, which is a 30-day rather than a 1-year movement. Again, unless it is impactful and related to the major progressed and even more importantly, the natal, in our system, we do not consider these. So everything really falls back to the center of the chart as to how we look and how we understand and how we interpret. Now, if you look at page 19 and 20 in the first chapter, and this I'm using the green book, and the page numbers may or may not match with the ones you're looking at, but it sets up in terms of the various impacts and influences. And this is a summation. So for instance, on the sun, any progressed aspect of the sun affects the vitality, the significance, and the authority. The moon, any progressed aspect of the moon affects the mental attitude, the domestic life, and everyday affairs. Mercury, any progressed aspect of Mercury affects the mental interests, the facility and accuracy of expression, and increases cerebral activity. And we've looked at this before in terms of book 2, book 3, and this is a summation that is then specifically applicable to how the progressed. Mars, which is often considered to be something discordant, any progressed aspects of Mars bring strife, haste, and increased expenditure of energy. How powerful and how impactful that is will depend upon its intensity, which is the harmony or disharmony astrodynes associated with it. So this is why doing a complete chart in the order that is suggested by Zane helps you build a foundation so that you can look at overall influences and not get just focused on one aspect or one planet, one house, to the exclusion of the others. You first look at the broad picture, then you start narrowing down based upon questions. Now, again, these aspects or these influences of these planets you should record in your notebook, combining it then with the other information about the sun and all the different planets that you'll see the influences of. Something also that you're going to see more of now is the influence of the ascendant and the midheaven. In many cases, they're treated like a planet in and of themselves, even though they aren't. But their influence is now going to become more critical and give more information and color to the interpretations as it's presented. So again, that information in 1920, which is just at the end before chapter 2, is take a look at those. Now, the chapter 2, which is serial lesson 111, is a series of calculations for hand construction of a chart. This is not easy, and it is time consuming and must be done accurately from the very start. Any error carries forward. So you want to check and double check and triple check the calculations and how you put things in. This is especially critical if you're doing something rectification, which we'll talk about a little later, when you don't know the exact time of the birth. That can make a huge difference. And if you're trying to rectify or correct a chart based upon events that have happened in a person's life, this is where it gets a very interesting. So every important event in life is reflected in the major progressions involving the planets and houses that rule the event. Also make note that there is a potential for more than one significant major progression event in any chart, and that's on page 26. Sometimes we stop when we see one major progression of significance, and we then fail to pick up on something that is beginning to occur or co-occurring. So this is the reason that we try to take as broad a perspective and really a snapshot so that we can gain as much influence, understanding of the influences that are impacting the individual. Now, for those, on some of the previous coursework, we looked at Hore. We'll look at some of the other ways to interpret charts. The rules are the same. The broader perspective and information that you collect, the more that you are going to have a timely and, if you will, impactful response to the individual or individuals you're working with. So don't get hung up on just one thing that happens. In chapter 3, serial lesson 112, you want to note aspects that are made particularly with the natal chart characteristics. If two transits make a square, it is likely insignificant unless it also is in aspect with the natal chart or the major progressed. So remember that we're focusing on the natal, secondarily on the major progressed. The minor progressed and the transit are contributors, but not determiners all of themselves. No chart stands alone except the natal chart. Even the progressed chart is subject to the foundation of the natal chart. And that's something really important to bear in mind. The natal chart is who we are. One way to understand a progressed chart differing from a natal chart is a natal chart are the influences at birth and essentially who we are. As we age, the progressed chart takes on more influence, but not contradictory to who we basically are in the natal chart. Now, could there be exceptions to this, particularly in terms of traumatic events or very dramatic circumstances? And the answer is yes, but those are more the exception than the rule. The natal chart is foundational. It's just important to make sure that everything you're looking at relates back to that. And I'll probably say that a half dozen more times. Make notebook entries on the impact of each planet listed on page 45 to 53 of the Green Book. This, again, is something that cannot be overstated, and it's something that is very important to do. Drop my book. Sorry. So you get more definition and more color here by looking at the information contained on each planet. And again, incorporate this into your notebook, combining, adding additional understanding of how these planets are influencing everyday life. Serial lesson 113, chapter 4. Some general notes here. And this is a generalization. Conjunction, parallels, and inconjunct are favorable for Venus and Jupiter, but unfavorable for Mars and Saturn. Now, be aware that just because you have a square or if you have a opposition does not mean that it is negative. You have to look at whether the astrogines are positive or negative, and then to understand the whys and hows associated with it. While these generalizations of conjunctions being positive are true, a conjunction can also be a negative event, particularly if it is something concerning the Mars and Saturn, possibly Pluto and some of the others as well. Now, note the unfavorable aspects in your notebook for each planet. And this is really an important section, 68 through 76. I hadn't thought about all of the negative, and later on we'll look at positive aspects related to Saturn, to Mars, but even to Venus, even to the sun, what those that we typically attribute to be very positive aspects. Every astral body is like a two-sided coin. There are those aspects that are positive, or those influences that are positive. There are those influences that can be negative. Nothing is 100% one way or the other, but they're still the same coin. And so again, understanding the perspective, understanding the context that the planets represent is something that is critical to do. Serial lesson number 5, minor progressions of the sun and angles. This chapter 5, serial lesson 114. Again, minor progressions only reinforce the effects of the major progressions in the natal chart. And the remainder of this chapter is really a series of calculations for manual chart construction. For those of you who learn calculus, this is where that type of, and trigonometry, those types of calculations and understandings become useful. It does not require that you understand that, but what you're dealing is with the mathematics of circles and the mathematics of often three-dimensional settings. And that's what trigonometry is about, is not necessarily two-dimensional, but more three-dimensional, and interrelationships based upon that. Take a look at that. Again, we will have a separate class or two that's still being worked on now in terms of ways and methodology and practice in terms of manual chart construction. Minor progressions of the moon and planets, chapter 6, serial lesson 15. This is really an important chapter to come to an understanding of with the information and the knowledge base you have right now. You will learn, you will mature in terms of understanding the application of this. So if you read through it and you can only glean one or two useful items, so be it. More will come, you'll become aware of more as it goes. So the harmony and discord of the minor progression, again, it's of little consequence other than reinforced with the major aspect. Note the impact of favorable of each planet. And this is where that yin and yang, that opposite side of the coin that we talked about in chapter 5, it was a negative. Chapter 6, here we have the positive. And then the remainder is on manual calculations. You think they like to manually calculate? Well, think about it. Prior to the advent of personal computers, everything had to be done manually. So what was the chance of error? And it was very great. Matter of fact, we found inconsistencies going back and looking at older charts just because of the way that a computer can check and recheck and more accurately put information together. Now, if the computer's program is wrong, then obviously you're going to get inaccurate information. That's why it's important to understand and be able to do a manual construction, just to understand and make sure that things really aren't off the rails here, and that for whatever reason that there's been some errors introduced. Serial lesson number 116, chapter 7. Transits with 1 degree of orb are only impactful to the related major progression or natal chart. A way of looking at this, and it's even mentioned here, is a transit lost the fuse. A minor progressed is the blasting cap. The major progressed in line with the natal is the actual explosive. So what happens if you light a fuse and it's not connected to anything? Well, it fizzles out. It may burn you, but it doesn't do much. A blasting cap can have impact, but not as much as if it is used to ignite a explosive charge. So this is something that, again, we look at the larger picture. We only use transits and minor progressed to see if they are setting up and activating a circumstance or a situation based upon the minor progressed, or again, the major progressed, or the natal chart. He also spends quite a bit of time here talking about something from a psychology standpoint is very important. And that is, when you're dealing with a client, it's really important what you tell them. It's important to what you tell them because, again, the future is uncertain. There are multiple paths. So if you see that they're based on the house, based upon the planetary influence, based on the aspects, that there is a probability of an illness or a death or some financial stress, some financial catastrophe, be careful what you tell them or how you frame that. If you instill a suggestion and they become locked on that, even though they're aware of it, that telling them, in essence, pushes them down that path to where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that maybe was not even necessary, and in all probability was not necessary. One of the ways that I have looked at this and done it and been counseled by others to do it is, if you do see something that's pretty dramatic or pretty impactful, is to say that there is the potential for a certain type of action or activity, but then present them with the mental or spiritual alchemy solution. So if you present a challenge, present the way out or the way around or the focus. And remember, we're not medical professionals unless you are a licensed medical professional diagnosing illnesses, or even the indication of that should be done very carefully because of liability, but also this is not the role we play. If a person has susceptibility to cardiac conditions, there are ways and methodologies, first of all, beginning with seeing their physician, to encourage them to take better care of how they eat, reducing stress, all of these things, along with other aspects that are important to do. And so again, and I think that was noted here, we don't predict death. We're not into the business of telling someone, well, you're going to die in the next 6 months. Again, that's inappropriate. And I don't see any good outcome from that. We all should live each day as if it is our last day. If we do that, then we have a degree of satisfaction and a degree of happiness that I think otherwise may not be obtained. So be careful in how you frame things. Think about it. Now, one thing that I recommend is I try to write things out, particularly around that question. And then when I'm giving that information, I review the written material and try not to talk too much off the cuff or extemporaneously. That way I don't inadvertently put a suggestion in their head that isn't helpful. Rectifying the horoscope, chapter 8, serial lesson 117. So what do you do if you don't have an accurate birth time, birthplace? Often what you'll see it reflected of someone will use noon or they'll use midnight. Why? Because the ephemeris are based upon one of those two time frames. If you do that, the information is going to be a very general reflection. It will not be specific and be able to use for specifics. If you get into this situation, and this comes from experience, is you ask and look back at major events that have happened. Noted on page 152 in serial lesson is physical characteristics, use of key words, midheaven estimation, the prenatal epoch. You can look at the various ways, and you won't use just one in all likelihood. As what Zane is recommending here, there's a variety of approaches that can and should be taken to try to tune in as much as possible to a accurate. Now, if you can set the midheaven and you can set the ascendant, you're getting pretty close. You still may be off on your house, especially if there's planets within those houses in terms of aspects, but you're going to be closer than you would be that if you use just noon or midnight as a standalone. So again, just be aware of these. And this is something that I still do very seldom, only because of the time and energy that it takes to be able to do this with any degree of accuracy. I spend approximately 2 hours to 4 hours on a chart when I have accurate information, and that's using the computer in terms of gaining the perspective and trying to answer the question. It is not, I've heard of people spending days, literally days, trying to rectify, and even then still only having a little better than a generalization. So this becomes, again, challenging to do, but it's something that also, if you see that you run a chart and it just doesn't make sense, go back and check, because even when people think they know the accurate time or place of their birth, they may be wrong. It is not unusual for errors to occur, particularly if the time of birth or place of birth is not noted on the birth certificate, but come from an individual's memory. Inaccuracies do crop up, or locations change. And what was called one thing is now called something else, and there's a similar place on the other side of the state. So all kinds of interesting occurrences happen when you're trying to understand birth time and place of birth. So what is the role of the astrologer? And this is chapter 8 again, serial lesson 117. We deal, as noted on page 164, in probabilities, not assurances. And again, I can't emphasize using spiritual and mental alchemy effectively to present approaches, solutions when you're giving information that is concerning or possibly negative. One thing that Zane mentions here as well in this chapter that I think we need to be reminded of is one of the things that we are committed to. I'm not going to say we take an obligation to, but as you get in and complete this course, part of your initiation is that you're working to contribute to the universal welfare in all of your actions and deeds. Ask yourself the question, is this horoscope I'm preparing contributing to universal welfare? Is it solving problems or creating problems? Is it helping someone, or is it inhibiting someone? Now, if you, and I don't recommend this, but sooner or later someone will ask you to do a history chart of looking at two individuals and say, are they compatible? Or a person in a place. And this is where it gets really complicated and complex, because even dissimilar people can have a positive and good life together, even though it looks like maybe they shouldn't or won't. So you just, again, as what you're communicating adding to and contributing in a positive way to the experience that we're all looking and seeking. We'll come back and answer that question in just a minute. So this is something that I don't think we emphasize enough, and really is important when you're constructing, is making sure this universal welfare. This material had so much specific of how to construct a chart that, unlike other volumes, it didn't have many generalized principles or as many recommendations or considerations. Both volume 10-1 and 10-2 require a serious commitment. Book 8, book 10, 1 and 2 are where people get hung up. This is, you make it through these, you start to build the foundation and move forward. Everything else then is, in retrospect, looking at the use of the Tarot, Sacred Tarot, and of astrology. Now, book 11 will start dealing with divination, not in the way you may think, but in the use of other methodologies and symbolism. From here, we're almost halfway through this course. After book 11, we are halfway through this, the number of books that Zane had pulled together, which is a monumental work. I'm going to encourage you to focus, to dedicate yourself to the completion of these books. Now, if you have not started at book 1 and worked your way up, but just picked up book 10 and are attempting to go through it that way, I'm strongly recommending you go back and pick up book 1 and start and work your way forward. Again, form, if you've not done it, a 3-ring notebook divided by signs, planets, and houses, because the information on how to assimilate and to interpret and understand is spread throughout, to date, 10 volumes, and will even grow larger as we progress forward in the next 11 volumes. This is material that, again, is focused on providing a life, understanding a life path. It isn't going to tell you what to do. What it's going to do is give the tools to understand what you are doing or what you can be doing. And I think that's a difference that many people don't understand. They think, well, you know, I get my chart done, then I basically am set. Well, no, what it is you have an understanding of influences in your life, both positive and those that aren't positive, that will influence you in a significant way. What you do with it is totally up to you. And the encouragement then is to make, especially for the universal good, make the highest and best use of that information, our relationships, and how we live in the world around us today. So that's what we have. I am going to, at this point, stop the share, the recording, and then we will go to our closing ceremony. Here.